Hello everyone, today we talk about 18th century cavalry, a topic we didn't expand much previously on, and we will put together a bit of information from lots of different topics actually. We will be observing the return of collision, fundamentally experimented, at least since the mid 17th century, but even there actually the developments of the first half are quite interesting. We will have to check them. You know what happened, right? That the previous 16th century caracal tactics was gradually abandoned with the increase of firearms at the expense of pikemen among infantry, and therefore cavalry, albeit stopped now with musketeer fire, still had a greater use than in the past against infantry formations. This would evolve gradually into linear tactics that we have discussed at some levels, especially in terms of discipline, not quite of mechanism or function, but once again we will do that also on another occasion. And observing also the we could say the return or revival of the knight, of the cavalry, we could say, after the decline of the politische Soldats, right? The idea that after all, look at the Spanish tercio or also other infantry formations that had their own space within this world in which permanent professional armies under the guidance of a sovereign were still quite rare, right? And that by the 18th century instead were being restructured with a different hierarchy, with something that is very different from the knight, the warrior of the ancient tradition, the older tradition, but still retain the idealism sometimes that can be observed in figures like Marlborough, Prince Eugen, and Charles XII of Sweden in the first, at the beginning of the 18th century, and observing therefore the continuity of in cavalry importance in this sinusoidal trend that you can spot, especially during at least faster, more swinging during the modern age than in other times in history. Like by the end of the 19th century, that would be brutally cut in a way, or reduced at least to somewhat marginal role, and that is also debatable, right? Even during World War I, actually cavalry, especially at the beginning and at the end, and especially in different theaters from the Western Front, had still its own things to say, also compared to the Middle Ages, was when the change was much slower, and in which, after all, you see that cavalry is not always decisive per se, right? Throughout all this period, it's essentially the 13th century that sees the true peak, the true dominance of uncontrasted dominance of cavalry on the battlefield, right? In the previous centuries was slightly different, in the centuries afterwards was also different, and therefore it's this big game that must be read naturally, must be explained naturally, not just from a military point of view, but from a political and social one, because otherwise you don't understand why what was brought on the field triggered those results to happen, and we can say that throughout all the 18th century, the theorists of collision, we could say, remained, in spite of the growing importance of firearms, literally this wall of fire that musketry infantry could put up in line. This is naturally also has its own exceptions just across the world during colonialism easily, but also on Western grounds, Europe, or also the northeast of America. Look at the War of American Independence, what linear tactics had to deal with in the Appalachians, for example, or and how the tide could be turned in this regard. But let's say that there had been all a great debate during the same 18th century where linear tactics is fully formed. Essentially, it also changes because the armies of the beginning of the 18th century are something different from the ones of the second half of the century, and the Napoleonic era obviously will change important aspects of this, especially concerning collision proper, right, and a great concentration of mass cavalry, for example. But also the debate on column and line, that for Napoleon, the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, has been, sometimes, in part, I wouldn't say misinterpreted, because historiography has clarified this, but, back in the day, and still in the, let's put it in this way, as much as infantry fundamentally homogenized itself in terms of, musketeers, therefore decreasing the pike element, still there were military theorists that were trying to, to force against the development of linear tactics, that columns and other infantry formations could essentially break successfully against the enemy line, and therefore proposing this idea of what the pikemen were meant to do basically in the previous centuries, and that had disappeared at the point when musketry fire had ceased their effectiveness, so that their formations would arrive at the enemy lines disrupted, right, and therefore could not come in hand-to-hand combat with musketeers that would flee at that point. And throughout all the 18th century, there were people who started saying, this can be done, right? There must be a way we can put this to use. And there are also examples, naturally, in this enormous. Think about the intensification of warfare in general, all the examples that we can study also with a greater historical, detail, information. But definitely this line failed, right? Because objectively, linear tactics, at least on the Western battlefields, remained fundamentally the base, and it was kept being developed throughout, in its own essentials. But this was somewhat an incomplete debate, just the one about the infantry that naturally has to take into consideration it was cavalry and artillery as well. You know that during the 18th century, this idea that armies began, we've seen it also in the Frontkriege, to be led and commanded in a way that was exalting the maneuver for the sake of itself, and this idea of deploying, redeploying, essentially for cutting, outflank the enemy, cutting its supply lines, and all this, ballet fundamentally was somewhat crystallizing also the tactical innovation, whereas, lots of things were changing, also technologically speaking, but especially from a political, social point of view, and you can see how the Napoleonic tactics at some point by the purists of that tradition were seen as somewhat brutal and rough and unrefined, simply because Napoleon made this great employment, in fact, of collision, right, of this concentrated firepower in a single part of the formation, especially with artillery. And look at Gribeval and the influence that in the late 18th century that system had to unhinge the previous assumptions, and cavalry, right, that definitely increased further in importance during the Napoleonic Wars compared to previous times. But cavalry, definitely throughout all the 18th century, was seen in many ways a viable way to fundamentally break the assumption that collision was useless, because actually cavalry had regained in many ways its own specific weight on the field, and it was especially diversifying in functions, tactical functions that fundamentally would remain unaltered for 2 centuries, right? Because still in the 19th, even beginning of the 18th century, was still a continuity with the various cavalry specialties that emerged from the early modern period in many ways in forms of traditions, of fighting styles, of ethnic specialties that Western warfare absorbed and readapted, right? Often looking actually at beyond itself in a narrow sense, meaning that pike and shot and eventually just shot tactics in this period were mostly developed in Western Europe, right? That's where you had the states and the societies were capable of developing even a certain technicality and manpower and degree of collective discipline, etc. That was necessary to to wipe out what was essentially the older way of making war. Like even in terms of pike and shot tactics, look at what the Russians did in Siberia, right, against the horse archery of the steppes, etc. So there is this Western dominance that is expanding and consolidating, right, even naturally outside the European borders. And it's beginning exactly here. But it actually is still fueled in its military culture by an Eastern element, right? Eastern meant sometimes just as Eastern European, right? In Europe, the steppes finish in Hungary, right? And they continue up to Vladivostok, up to the Bering Strait. And that's essentially this enormous world that it's just next door, right? It's the same Europe, frankly, the same Europeans that have, look at the Balkans, look at Eastern Europe, that had maintained, for many reasons, a bit of local traditions, but also this continuous range action of the steppes element in the local warfare, where in another, whether it was, this unstable, nomadic, semi-nomadic entities. Look at the Golden Horde or the Crimean Khanate and all these waves of of Tatars or even Cossacks. So you see even in their same Ukrainians that start living in a nomadic fashions from a sedentary past, but also the Ottoman Empire that brought people troops coming from literally the whole from Eurasia and Africa even. That's therefore injecting very often this element, especially in the Middle East, had maintained its own importance. Was horse archery and light cavalry in general. That had an impact on Western warfare. This had it in many ways. The changes were not so linear, or there were many backs and forth. There were many tactical specialties that we see today that fundamentally were re-edited fundamentally in a Western fashion, or maybe with a coming back to the Eastern model, but still in a context that required them in the West, right? So there's a lot of blending there of tactical specialties, which of course cavalry owed much to the areas where traditionally the mounted arm had been more important, naturally throughout all the 18th century, cavalry maintained definitely the function of light arm, right? And it was apt to those mansions that required mobility, right? You don't have coming back of heavy cavalry like in medieval times, right? Where there also was light cavalry accompanying it all the time. There are certain anachronisms of success, such as the Polish winged Hussars, that however were fundamentally still a Western product in many ways. Poland as a Western or Westernized, whatever you want to call it, country that had a much more Eastern influence past in its military culture. But fundamentally in Western warfare, the cavalry remains light. Right, infantry is fundamentally the bulk of the force. The majority of losses in combat were inflicted by muskets once again. Second by cavalry, and eventually by artillery. But the new game triggered by linear tactics in the interaction of the three arms, infantry, cavalry, artillery, required sophistication, further articulation and specialization of a cavalry. And therefore you have fundamentally these three elements that are they all have different origins, right? The Dragoons, the Hussars, and the Uhlans, right? That filled with their boldness and their beautiful uniforms and their fierceness, right? The chronicles of gallant warfare, right? There is a sort of pre-romantic breath on this, beautiful warriors armed and equipped, right, in a way that actually imitates the steppe, right, and that repropose in this specific sense the ancient dilemma in warfare between boldness and discipline, right? Because cavalry, by definition, as an arm, cannot defend, right? Cavalry cannot defend. The only way for cavalry to defend is to become infantry, right? And that's what dragoons, as we will see now, were for fundamentally. But cavalry is meant to charge, and charging requires shock tactics, and also a certain practice to for the training of the same that basically makes surviving the this individualistic ethos, if you want, that have been proper of chivalry. And we have seen in many videos, and I hope that we will keep expanding on how our Western chivalry fundamentally owes an enormous lot to the migration era and to the Eastern War, to the think about even during this period in Poland, the so-called Sarmatism, right? The pride of the Polish Szlachta, the high nobility, to essentially claim to as an ethnic Polish nobility, in fact, aristocracy, military aristocracy more, to be preferably more Sarmatian in origin, right? Ideally, right? It was an invention, right? Then Slav even. And this was reproposed with this love for the steppe, right? For this idea. Even look at their equipment, right? And how they imitated the ancient forms, the scale armor of the Sarmatian knights back in the day, because that's where the knight fundamentally emerges. And therefore, we're proposing the point of, you need an arm that is, if you want, hot-headed. We'll see the Hussars, especially, but even the Uhlans and other type of medium light cavalry have this dash, this sense of sometimes of even a lack of personal safety, right? Of instinctive survival that was the raison d'être of their own tactical function, just throwing themselves against the enemy. Obviously, with intelligence, not just to be butchered, and therefore we're proposing exactly here the problem between boldness and discipline, between dash and order in many ways, which was never quite solved in the end, because still you need, even in highly disciplined armies like the ones that were developing in the 18th century, certain types of troops will still literally lose their head by charging straight against the enemy and overwhelming it with the shock. So the origins of this, the Dragoons, the Hussars, and the Uhlans are interesting on their own, because that's where the non-linear process in their development is evident, historically speaking. And sometimes we don't even know exactly what the origin really is, right? The Dragoons, for example, have quite mysterious origins, right? But their function was fundamentally all the same, right? They were cavalry capable of fighting both on foot and on horseback, right? And also because certain dragoon regiments actually never had horses by themselves. Actually, we've seen it, for example, in Polish armies. Initially, the dragoons were actually infantry troops at some point, and horses cost. And this, idea of a medium cavalry that is flexible and can move here and there, it's automatically associated to a multifunctionality that, in a way, transcends the same essence of cavalry or infantry. This is specifically true for the dragoons, right? And concerning even the origins of their names, we don't know. Some dated back even to the famous Draconari, that is the Roman cavalryman that brought the Draco, right? The ensign made like a dragon form shaped windstock, right? And that had objectively remained there as an ideal, as a form. Just think about the dragon in medieval heraldry, or we know that the last dracones actually disappeared from actual use in 13th century Germany. So from the migration era, actually, these models, these ideas, these visions were always the same, right? But there you see the constant and recurrent influence of the steppe and how actually close to Western Europe it went, right? Germany is fundamentally the frontier of Western Europe. There's not a clear eastern border. There's never been, and that's where beyond this that there is fundamentally not the steppe literally meant, but definitely military cultures that for centuries and centuries have fundamentally been invested by these waves of nomadic peoples and had to cope with them, including settling them. Right, this happened all over. I don't know, Poland, Hungary. Right, so really there is a great frontier with Eurasia that is so large that doesn't properly even have a border in this case. But there are definitely other origins of the Dragoons that we hear of. Right, according to some. The name derives from a dragon ensign that the Duke of Brissac in 1560 assigned to the unit of mounted infantry that he had created in homage to Mary de' Medici, right? On the imitation of the Italian troops that had been invented by the Vitelli brothers, right? Camillo first and Paolo and Vitellozzo eventually, that however had in the great-grandfather of Mary, John from Black Bands, right, a model of imitation. So even here you see that fundamentally Renaissance warfare had already produced in its tactical practice the need of having troops that could mount and dismount, and therefore cover these various tactical roles. And here we are in France, in Italy, so in the heart of Western Europe, and still there is this element that evidently what was needed. But even attaching this to Mary de' Medici is not correct. It's that the protagonists here seem rather Catherine de' Medici and the Count of Brissac, Charles I de Cossé, right, that would have created the unit with a great timing after 1 year after the death of Henry II of France, husband of Catherine de' Medici, when she assumed the regency, right? But the explanations do not stop here, right? The two members of the Gommiacourt family, Guillaume and Raoul, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance respectively, had the nickname of Dragon, right? And they had been, in fact, in command of units of mounted infantry. And to their name, to their surname actually was added Dragon, right? And maybe their troops had the same destiny. And some say, Dragoons comes from the dragon, right? The English name for type of arquebus, but the use of this arm is not attested in France, right? And the same is perhaps true also for the little dragon, where the arquebus fuse was fixed. And there is also another curious but maybe more probable in some ways origin of the term dragon, deriving from Trager, right, a German word that means the bearer fundamentally. And in the French army of Piedmont of 1524 were in service Basque mounted arquebusiers over horse led by German knights. And when the shooter therefore wanted to come back on saddle, he called his companion Trager, and from here the passage to dragon is actually pretty simple. The Hussars also have, they were this other very famous specialty of ethnic light cavalry, let's put it in this way, of Eastern origin, as we were saying before, that had become gradually regular. Even in here, we don't clearly know where the origin of the word is, right? According to an hypothesis, Hussar derives from Hush, which is 20, that probably was to signify a group of 20 knights. And according to another hypothesis instead, that recently has also gained more credit, the origin should be found to be in the Slavic term Gussar, which means banded, right? And that's essentially what the Hussars had been technically, in their, this extremely common type of mortiering cavalry, the light cavalry you can find all over the Balkans, were famous, even in employment of certain Western forces. Think about the Venetian Stradios that were taken basically from all over the Balkans, mostly from Albania, but still pretty close to Hungary. This mercenary cavalry, in fact, entered in Hungarian and Polish service, right, as a defined type on its own, and would have gradually acquired actually heavy character in both countries. This is the interesting aspect of the Hussars, that a few people know that actually Hussars in the Renaissance emerged as heavy cavalry from this lighter background, right, and that expanded in Hungary and Poland. But even here there is a split, because in Poland, right, remain as the famous winged Hussars, right, as a specific typology embodied by the same Schlachter as we have seen. In Hungary, instead, since the country was destroyed by the Ottoman invasion, right, while Poland could still feel the structural heavy cavalry, that even the winged Hussars equipment was one of the few aspects that the state tended to centralize, the famous lances in their production, right. In Hungary, instead, there's this subtle destruction, right. The country is transformed into a frontier that is between the Ottoman Empire and its eastern Eurasian allies, and still in this frontier warfare context, where the light cavalry at that point is really famous. That the push, that the properly the steppe that exists in Hungary is the ideal ground for these troops, and therefore here we have properly this split, and this Hungarian branch, let's call it in this way, will be the one that will be imitated by the Western powers, that will make of it fundamentally of technically would be light cavalry for, I don't know, late medieval or Renaissance standards, but for 18th century standards, where cavalry centers were much lighter than before, they were somewhat a medium infantry, right, without armor actually. But even here, there is the early modern age first, where this process of gradual loosening of also the losing of armor, right, and the obvious fact that armor in the 18th century is not out there anymore, if not maybe at the beginning for some, for officers or some NCOs, etc., but just with some function actually, but not for the troop, as you know. So there are all these factors that interplay. And there is also another explanation to the etymologically speaking for hussar, that looks at the Latin cursarius, right? That is the even here the mortier fundamentally, but he who runs properly, right? So even here something connected to that type of light cavalry specialization. So there are so many hypotheses, because these names originated in context. You have an idea of how many terms we have lost from those times, right? We can't really see clearly in here. These are areas of Europe in the Center East that they're not very well documented, right? We don't know much better, than that compared to Western Europe than medieval Europe fundamentally. And therefore, what eventually the specialization, how the names was used to define these different troops is not entirely known. So the first, let's say, modern hussars of the Hungarian light type entered in service of France in 1636, right? By work of the Hungarian refugee George Esterhazy, right? But this unit was disbanded after barely 20 years for the excessive oddness of its members, right? Consider here what the time you're talking about, Baroque Europe, and it's literally the time of the excess, the time of the this extreme, maybe not yet the disease that is mostly the one of abundance from the end of the same century, but still of this fanatically aristocratic, individualistic ethos, and life of adventure. It's the same context of the Three Musketeers, right? It's the same mentality, and that also makes you understand, in parallel to the very gradual, growth of the modern state, what armies were fundamentally about, right? Even a foreign guard unit, like in this case, could become part of a very heterogeneous army. We've seen it talking about Renaissance armies in general, and from this, let's say, failure in France, it was Austria actually to benefit from the talent of this cavalry, since the Habsburgs could hire it among the Hungarians that they ruled on, and transforming it over time in a regular cavalry. And it's from here that it spread all over Europe, eventually loosening basically every local character except for the exterior ones. They think about the picturesque hairstyles and the characteristic clothing of the hussar that were particularly appreciated, by the way, by the Prussians, right? That since Frederick the Great, so still in somewhat of late time, mid-18th century, had excellent hussar units, right? Part of the reason also, even in there, considering the great problem of the Prussians that didn't have particularly large mounts, so they also were more tactically, daring and experimenting. Think about Frederick himself, and his enormous achievements in the history of the art of war. So that really makes you understand how some of the most talented minds of 18th century warfare actually saw in this tactical, properly cavalry unit actually a great mean, right? A great potential, and the eccentricism of the hussars became therefore proverbial, as much as their recklessness and rashness that perhaps finds its better expression in the words of the General Antoine Charles Louis Lasalle, the first sabler of France, right? They called like this in Napoleonic times, that stated, quote, that a hussar that by 30 years old is still alive is a slob, right? And that was not very far from the truth. And actually, Lasalle himself died at 34, so 4 years later, during the concluding phases of the Battle of Wagram, that is, one of the single most brutal battles in all the Napoleonic Wars in Austria, where actually, and it's kind of an irony of fate, a Hungarian grenadier shot him with a musket ball in full forehead. And this is what these guys were meant to do, charging straight without even minding about their incolumitity, but just betting everything on their dash. And the Uhlans, well, the Uhlans were basically the originally the term has I think a Turkic origin, and it actually was were the belongings to the tribes where was reunited the elite of the Mongolian warriors, right? It's actually a Turkic Mongolian term, and these troops were basically lancers that would be spread especially in service of Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and that had stemmed, however, as a corps from Poland, right? And it's not by chance that actually these three countries were the ones that partitioned the same Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right? And this unit, as you know, the Poles, by the way, hired en masse these troops from the steppes, especially from the Ukraine, but even further east, right? Sometimes even settling in the same Poland. And the Uhlans, as such, and even here, detached from their ethnographic context, maintained for a long time, even up to look at photos of the First World War, the characteristics of in their uniforms that were traditional of their country of origin, such as the characteristic rogativka, right, the flat beret of quadrangular form. And the Uhlans brought originally the curved saber and lance, right? Even if later were also provided with firearms, and the heavy and curved saber, Eastern style, would be ever more shaped like a scimitar, right? And this change has to do probably and properly actually with the lightening of the West, actually the disappearance of Western armor. So that basically it's all about cut, especially in pursuit, right? Where that blade shape is excellent, right? Whereas we've seen that Uhlans were equipped also with these lances, were actually pretty nasty things, and even though they were, you know, as light as the other technical specialties, like the Hussars especially, they however had this increased kind of piercing nature, we could say, as a unit, right? And what is interesting about these cavalry typologies is that the best 18th century generals, as we've seen, were began to employ them, right, in a way that gave again the full importance to cold steel, full charge, right? You know, and a characteristic that had been lost fundamentally in some times of, you know, the previous times where actually the aristocratic ethos was still strong, right? It's obvious that by the 18th century the aristocratic ethos was lower than, say, in the second half of the 16th, right? But the battlefields at that time said something else, in the sense that cavalry had been reduced to a very little thing compared to the 18th century. Not that it was unimportant, right? It wasn't just Caracol, as many people believe, because actually Caracol was still contemplating the charge in the end, right? You know, these guys shot a very short distance to the enemy forces, but they hopefully would sometimes even literally throw their pistols against them and charge with their swords, right? So if the enemy formation had been softened up enough, right? But in the 18th century, you see that generals are not warlords, right? Like in the previous century, these are very attentive and precise professionals that began to calibrate very accurately the role of all of these troops, because they can dispose them in their armed forces in a way that previously was much less to be given for granted as a standard base, right? And they had in part produced those same tactical specialties from the sheer practice, right? Not from doctrine, because you needed Dragoons, you needed Hussars, you needed other light cavalry types. This increasing collision actually spreads also among other unit types. Think about the cuirassiers, for example, that originally were literally those guys that were covered in iron because technically they were still meant to, to stop mostly firepower, right? And in 18th century, that is not meant to be the case anymore, but cuirassiers have their own armor to, in part, against firearms. In general, it's still better than nothing, but mostly against other cavalrymen proper. And this happens towards the end of the 18th century, basically, the 17th century, by decreasing the amount of of firearms proper, and turning this iron sights, let's say, from the English terminology, into proper shock cavalry, right? Often employed naturally against infantry, but also against other cavalry. And the whole thing spreads in general to tactics in general. For example, Sweden was a country where, as you know, military innovation was a quite big thing also for the rest of Europe since the mid-17th century. And if we look actually at later times, still in previous times we're talking obviously about Gustavus Adolphus. But let's talk about Charles XII also. At the beginning of the 18th century, during, for example, the Great Northern War, developed charging technique with saber, carried out with a wedge formation on 3 lines, right? Very solid lines. And we're talking about large units, right? The Swedish basic tactical unit of cavalry was the squadron, and 2 combined companies of horsemen carried out the tied formation, knee behind knee, 2 or 3 ranks, charge to attack at high speed with cold steel, right? So we're talking about fundamentally every company was 125 men, and every squadron was 2 companies, 250 men. And yes, even you see the organic here, how it's actually the other way around. It's today, like the squadron is a smaller unit, but at the time, even the organic experimentalism was large, and the terminologies were still somewhat confused, or better, confusing from our own perspective. But at the time, we're pretty aware of what they were doing, and probably at Charles XII's times, the Swedish cavalry's technique and maneuverability was, at least one of the foremost of its day, if not the foremost, and it worked out pretty well, right? Especially against wavering infantry units, and against cavalry. Naturally, when they found steady infantry, once again, as we were saying before, musketry fire was enough to repel these cavalry charges with heavy losses, but still, infantry is not always in the place and in the condition of presenting the ideal readiness, right? And it would be unfair to omit 2 other great generals of the beginning of the 8th century, Marlborough and Eugen of Savoy, that were unanimous fundamentally in preferring the full charge, right, over firepower of cavalry, because technically, you see, there were still fire, like missile cavalry, we could say, right, at this point. Whereas these 2 commanders that began to play actually with very big toys, meaning that, look at what Britain was beginning to field at the beginning of the 18th century after the revolutions, in terms of sheer wealth and means to field armies, and look at the expansion of Austria against the Ottomans at the time. So these 2 some of the greatest generals in modern history were also to revalue, in this sense, the mass charge per se, right? In perspective, a century later, Napoleon would have done fundamentally the same with this even more further expanded means, right? Marlborough and Prince Eugene were living, by the way, in times in which, if you look at the international situation and strategic needs of the allies, of the great alliances, well, what was putting them together? France, Louis XIV France, and the beginning of the 18th century is marked by this, mastodontic increase, right, of in the size of armies proper, so much that basically, if you look at some of the greatest battles of this period, they couldn't even maneuver, they couldn't even command these troops all over the field, right? So that at a certain moment, by the mid-18th century, European armies began to be more compact, and somewhat more also improving in, technology speeding up, you need more money to invest, so in it, and so there is a balance between here, but the point is that it's obvious that with these great masses of men deploying here, difficult to command, to control, to coordinate. If you manage to have a very close-knit and inspired cavalry units, you can't launch these devastating charges into the enemy lines that actually, are still repelled. Here, cavalry doesn't solve the equation. Once again, here we are in the 18th century. It's nothing to do. It's muskets that rule on the field. But still, cavalry can do a lot, right, and inflict devastating losses. And what is interesting, going back on the concept of the cavalier, right, of the knight, bringing back, think about Prince Eugene, it was called like that, properly the noble knight, had a component of truth, right, because there is a paradox in a way that, even if, this is a process started from the end of the Middle Ages, kings, monarchs, great leaders were tended to be drawn away from combat because they were too important now politically to be risked, but it was very, very alive. We have seen it in the series that we started on Prince Eugene, the sense of extreme fanatic bravery that was associated to noble blood, and this idea that the nobleman had to be a knight, right? We like to emphasize especially the 18th century as in the age of enlightenment, but look at what reality really was. There is in an aristocratic world, and you'll see that duels, even tournaments, were still there. We're still technically there, and they were actually more widespread among the population, even the commoners, or at least people of some of lower rank compared to some actually the most powerful people in Europe. I mean, look at Marlborough or Prince Eugene. Even heads of states de facto for their personal power. Now, it really left that kind of and this was something you can't find. I don't know, look at the Dualists, if you have ever if you know what I'm talking about. During Napoleonic Wars, there were still this idea of the honor, trial by duel, all this stuff. And there are certain examples that from Marlborough and Prince Eugene, I think they are very meaningful. For example, at the Battle of Valcourt in 1689, Marlborough commanded the assault on the Allied left against the French and charged at the head of the cavalry of the guard, supported by 2 battalions of infantry, by the way. Notice here the importance of cavalry infantry support. And the French withdrew in disarray, but a powerful cavalry rearguard prevented the Allies from taking full advantage of their victory. So see the importance of cavalry, even saving the day, but also compromising the situation, potentially, and the involvement of very high-rank officers in this, at the lead of these charges. Even more, at the Battle of Ramillies, in 1706, Marlborough, that was commander-in-chief at that point, rode over the cavalry melee with his staff, right, hoping that his presence would help steady the Allied troopers. And he took part in 2 charges, right, the job of a brigadier rather than a commanding general. And in the second, he was thrown from his horse and almost trampled on in the swirl of horses, men and dust, which actually happened countless times to anybody who mounted on horseback. Doesn't matter if it was a king, right, or a common mercenary. But look at military history. During the Middle Ages, it's very, very frequent, actually, and it was a great risk. I mean, cavalry. Look at the beast himself. The horse is a freaking monster. It's a huge beast, and especially these charging units were some of the toughest, largest breeds, most muscular, beefy things. I mean, can you imagine what it means just to fall during a charge and having all these mists running over you? Like there are lots of people died in this way, and a reason for which actually the the staffs of the commanders were pretty still up to the task of, like in the case of Ramillies, to rush to the commander's aid, right? And in that case, also a regiment of Swiss infantry, right, in Dutch service advanced to cover him. So you see also how things here are always dangerous, but how's the guy is to go there, right, on leading the same cavalry charge anyway. So think about the contrast here of an art of warfare. This is transforming with its own logics, right, and society has to cope with that, and it should things vary, at a different speed. And Marlborough so little faith had in cavalry firepower that he restricted his troopers to 3 rounds of ammunition for use when guarding their horses at grass. That is, in battle, you don't have nothing to do with shooting. Dragoons in the British Army at the time were still conceived as sometimes dismounting musketeers, right? And so it's something that went on even throughout the beginning of the 18th century. But they were, for this reason, increasingly, however, being employed as conventional cavalry, right? And there are many examples, actually, of think about the storming of Schellenberg in 1704 by Hayes Dragoons, the later Royal Scots Greys, right, who rode forward to drop fascines into ditches as to facilitate the advance of the foot, right, and then attacked, dismounted as infantrymen, and finally, when the enemy broke, remounted and joined in the pursuit. And this is exactly what those lighter tactical specialties were to be found for, because it's not much about the fact of being cavalry, but literally, to cover spaces more quickly than other units and achieving certain results in different ways. So even as not as cavalry, right? Look at we may if you go look in Polish warfare playlist, we saw how this thing was way more advanced actually in those eastern countries than I don't know, in England, because of the simply look at how extended the Polish, Lithuanian, and Commonwealth really was, and especially in the eastern side, there is a step there, and you need units of that type. And it's very interesting because the Polish army in late medieval times was fully Western in character, right? The Dries with the further consolidation with the Lithuanian Commonwealth and the extension of enemies, in the east, etc., intervention against Muscovy, the Tartars, etc. The need of forming troops that are taken from that context. So here it's the eastern that comes back, right? And even here there is a sinusoidal tendency, but this is just for saying that there are certain needs that, according to the circumstances, and that's here that we can draw another comparison with Austria. Like, the Habsburgs fundamentally are, Holy Roman Emperors, but basically they own more land outside of Germany than in it, right? So the same goes for the Prussians, for example. We have seen even here how the thing overlapped with Hungary, with Poland, these areas where, exactly the Hussars, especially, for example, had begun. And I don't know, at the time of Marlborough, the British cavalry consisted entirely of horse and dragoons, right? But in Austria, right, that participates in the wars of coalition against France next to England, with think about Prince Eugen and Marlborough's friendship and joint command in many occasions. The Austrians were beginning to form the lightly equipped irregular bands of Hungarian and Croat horsemen that we've seen before, that were raised on the eastern and southern frontiers for service against the Turks, right, into regular regiments of Hussars. An example that would be followed afterwards by France as well, where we've seen that the Hussars had come into, to use briefly and minimally in the beginning of the 17th century, but the thing had been aborted. Well, at this point in the 18th century, kicks in back again. And these troops were mounted on small horses, armed with curved sabers, pistols, and sometimes carbines, being, useful for outpost duties, hit-and-run raids, pursuits, in fact, anything requiring rapidity of movement. And when faced by a formed squadron of horse and dragoons, of course, they would scatter generally, and perhaps reform later, sometimes even simply to flee. But in general, performing even there an important task, because driving, for example, a heavier cavalry towards a certain direction, even to use your lighter troops as a bait, exactly for the purpose, is an important aspect of the story. It connects with, we were talking about this, for example, just the other day on the von Clausewitz, think of concentration of forces in time. These, the whole picture here is becoming ever more sophisticated, if you want. And regarding Prince Eugen himself, if you look at the Battle of Blenheim, for example, in 1704, the painter Laguerre, that was, at the service of the Duke of Marlborough and representing and producing his work on his instructions, rendered a series of paintings related to the Battle of Blenheim, Hochstadt. In one of these, Prince Eugen is depicted as heading a cavalry charge on the village of Lutzingen. Right. Also, at the most famous Battle of Belgrade in 1717, the Austrian night attack, the last, the result of the day, to break the siege, because basically Prince Eugen was besieging Belgrade and he was besieged in turn by the Ottomans, so he had to break the blockade and it was this clamorous victory, one of the single greatest masterpieces in the history of in the annals of military history. And the Austrian night attack surprised the Ottomans, and after the first hours of fighting, so here there was naturally continuous infantry and cavalry coordination was extraordinary in that battle. While the sun rose, the Ottomans had predicted an opening in the center of the Austrian attack and attacked in force, right? And it's at this point that actually the Austrian cavalry counterattacked, led by Eugen himself, right? And who not only pushed the Turks back, but also took their trenches, throwing the Ottoman camp into turmoil and causing the soldiers to flee. Right? And after 10 hours of fighting, the battle was won by the Austrians. And you can, just imagine what these battlefields actually were. Right? This was a time in which, gunpowder, after first of all, basically nobody saw anything on the field. Think about coordinating this whole stuff. We will look at different, especially with on the series dedicated to Prince Eugen, there will be plenty other examples of that, even in the Battle of Turin, how during the War of Spanish Succession, how the battles were actually planned, what the importance of proceeding with order and with this pre-planned distribution of forces and and reserves, etc., to meet exactly with this constant hammering. Right, it was continuous combined tactics between infantry and cavalry, but shells and musket balls flying all around, cannonballs, and these people went straight into the melee, right? And this stuff was sick, right? The thing that these generals risked on their own in these clashes was utterly amazing, utterly amazing. I mean, Marlborough and Prince Eugene throwing themselves literally into the midst of the hell of fire, and coming out of there victorious. I mean, commanding an army, right? But still, there is this element of bravery, of individualism, of gallantry and of courage, right? That we also made a video on how it was built actually culturally for which purposes, and they had to do a lot actually with the collective discipline, right? That began to be ever more imposed exactly from cavalry, from within the same chivalry in the Middle Ages, and these guys in the 18th century, these aristocrats, were the direct descendants of this, and essentially replicating the same exact thing, and sometimes in a much more dangerous way than in the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages you could break your back, your neck, falling from horseback, etc. But technically you could also die with a good, literally being pierced straight in the chest or in the face. Even with full armor, sometimes during a cavalry charge. But knights tended to be rather more. First of all, they didn't like to kill each other very much because they knew how to profit from that, from imprisoning each other. But secondly, given the forces involved, I mean, look at the jowls that exist. Crossbow bolt and in a musket ball. Right here, it's crazy. It's crazy. A cannon literally makes you fly away in 1,000 pieces if it hits you, right? And this is the reality of 18th century warfare. When we look at wigs, powder face, lace, and we say, oh, well, this looks like a dance of kind of a, effeminated people. This is one of the most brutally martial and violent and tough encounter you can ever think, mentally speaking. So this is very important to bear in mind. It's very important to conceptualize, always realizing what's the greatness of this all, that it goes in parallel still with a great expansion of the art of warfare and the growing of professional armies, of centralized states, and the ability in here to manage something that is way more complicated than it was before, right? That in a collective sense. That is not easy, right? Let's stop it here because the parallelisms we could trace are somewhat very interesting, but we also have to be, to stay in topic. And this is what I wanted to talk to you about today, and it's really a small thought that I came up with just to to stress the moment of transition, but still the firm change, the thing that here the West was speeding up like crazy, right? And the art of Western warfare would dramatically expand in these times. Anyhow, for now, let's stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.